Our passage, our parable, is in Luke chapter 18, and it starts in verse 9, and it says this: "And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself: 'God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week, I pay tithes of all that I get.' But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven. But he was beating his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, the sinner.' I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted." Jesus gives us this vivid picture of 2 men praying at the temple. I like the wording that Jesus says about the Pharisee, that the man was praying to himself, which actually kind of shows you the direction of the Pharisee's heart and mind. And so we have the one person who's praying, thanking God for how awesome he is, not God, the person himself is. And you have the other person aware of his own flaws, asking God to be merciful, and that's the person who is justified before God. A movie came out, and any of you that are anywhere near my age are going to be familiar with this movie, and it's not a movie that I can recommend to you because we're in church, but I'm going to use it to talk about it now. Anyway, the movie was called Anchorman. It came out maybe 15, 20 years ago, and in the movie, Will Ferrell plays a San Diego anchorman who is completely divorced from reality. He overestimates his importance in the world, and there are plenty of funny things in the movie, but there's one exchange that I want to focus on. He sees a girl that he's interested in, and so this is the way that he tries to woo her at the beginning. He asks her this. He says, "Do you know who I am?" She says, "No." And he says, "I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal. People know me." And she says, "I'm very happy for you." And he keeps digging. He says, "I'm very important. I have many leather-bound books, and my apartment smells of rich mahogany." The reason this came to mind for me, this exchange, is that I'm pretty sure that each one of us knows people in our life that with the way that they talk to people and the way they present themselves, they are basically trying to say to everyone around them, do you know who I am? I'm kind of a big deal. I'm pretty important. People know me, and you should too. What Jesus is getting at this parable is pretty simple, that the person who thinks that they are a big deal is going to be humbled. A person who has their view of themselves divorced from reality is a person who does not know what God actually wants or requires. So the entirety of this message in one phrase is this. If you can walk away with anything, this is the one thing to walk away with. Self-importance is a deadly delusion. Self-importance is a deadly delusion. I say it's a delusion because a uncharacteristic and unrealistic sense of self-importance will keep you from seeing the world clearly. It will pervert, distort the way that you see the world, and it's deadly because it will lead you away from what God has called you to do. Every one of us has to fight against that urge to overestimate how important we are. What a lot of us end up doing is we do this. We overestimate our own good qualities. So we think we're better at the things that we're good at than we actually are. We will underplay our bad character traits, or compare ourselves to others to justify them. And we assume that everyone else around us should agree with us. And what this leads to ultimately is self-delusion. It leads us to compare ourselves to others, like the Pharisee in the prayer saying, "I'm glad I'm not like that tax collector." And eventually it leads us away from God's designs for our life. Self-importance is a deadly delusion. If there's one thing we can grasp from this parable, it's that. If you are overestimating how important you are putting yourself at odds with what God wants from your life. What we're going to do this evening is we're going to try something slightly different than the normal. I want to use a person from history as a sample of what a self-deluded, overly self-important person looks like. So with each thing that we talk about, I want to give you examples from the life of this one great person from history to show how their sense of self-importance took them away from God. So the person that we're going to talk about was a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You may have heard of him, you may have not. I'll tell you who he was, though. He lived from 1712 to 1778, so he lived in the 1700s. He died right around the time of the American Revolution. He was from Switzerland, but he spent most of his life in France. So most of the things that he did were among the French. And Rousseau was pretty clearly probably the most influential intellectual of the last 300 years. So of the people that would say we can use our rationality to make mankind in our image, he was the granddaddy of them all. So every intellectual that came after Rousseau gets a lot of their inspiration from Rousseau. So for Karl Marx, as an example, Rousseau was his biggest influence. You'll see in a moment, almost every Western political leader now, they owe a lot of the way that they look at the world to Rousseau. So a few things to know about him, just to set the ground rules before we get going. He had this basic insight. He believed that human problems came as a result of a broken society. So he had a very famous quote in his book, The Social Contract, where he said, "Every man was born free, but everywhere he's in chains," is what he says. And so basically what Rousseau was asserting is that humans are basically good, but it's our society that makes us go bad. So if you could fix society, then you can fix individual human problems. Now, I don't think I need to stretch very far for you to see that's the way that all of our politicians look at the world now. Rousseau was incredibly influential in that way. They view societal ills as the reason for individual human issues. So if we fix those, we can fix the others. So that's what Rousseau believed. And another very significant thing that Rousseau believed, and we'll talk about why in a little bit, he believed that the state was ultimately responsible for rearing and educating children. So not the family, but the state. So he believed that. We'll talk about why as we go a little farther in. So just keep in mind, we're going to use a lot of quotes from him to show what happens when a person has an overly realized sense of self-importance. So how does being self-important separate us from God? How does it lead us to a deadly delusion? The first thing is this: self-importance does alienate us from God. In Colossians 1, Paul says this: "Although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds." Paul says that our default status before God, if we don't know Jesus, is that we are alienated from God. We're hostile in mind, hostile in heart, and that comes from us thinking that we are the center of the universe and not God himself. So let's look at Rousseau as an example about the way that he looked at himself and how it might have alienated him from God. I have a couple quotes. I can't help but smile as I read them. We're going to have a good time. The first one he says is this: "The person who can love me as I can love is still to be born." Now keep in mind, he's not talking about romantic love. He's saying there is no human who can love the way that I can love. He said, "No one ever had more talent for loving than me." That's what he said. Now, he's not speaking hyperbolically. He actually believed that he was the best person who could love or be a friend of anyone in mankind. Another quote, he said, "I was born to be the best friend that ever existed." He meant it. It's not hyperbole. He repeatedly said that he was the best man alive, the most virtuous, the most wise, the most intelligent. Here's some more quotes. He says, "Show me a better man than me, a heart more loving, more tender, more sensitive. You can't do it. Posterity," meaning people in the future, "will honor me because it is my due. I deserve people to praise me in the future. That's how great I am." This quote is excellent. He says, "I rejoice in myself. My consolation lies in my self-esteem. If there were a single enlightened government in Europe, it would have erected statues to me." Now, I've tried to say things like that, but no one has built a statue of me yet. So this is the way that this guy viewed himself. He said, "I am the best man alive. I'm the wisest. I have the least malice in my heart. If the governments knew what they were doing, they would be erecting statues to me. That's how great I am." Now, if you're looking at this and you say, that does not sound like a very well-adjusted person, you're right. But I will also say, Rousseau was extremely influential. He was brilliant. He was a very persuasive writer. But his view of himself, that high self-esteem, alienated him from God. You would never find Rousseau beating his chest saying, "God have mercy on me, a sinner." He didn't think he was a sinner in the first place. If he was praying, he'd probably be saying, "God, thank you for me. Thank you for all the great things that I do and have done. In fact, you're lucky to have me. You should be thanking me." That's the kind of way that Rousseau would think. Edmund Burke was another philosopher alive when Rousseau was alive, and he said this: "Vanity was the vice which he possessed to a degree little short of madness." So you have this brilliant guy who is going to be very influential in the future, but he is completely hamstrung by his own sense of self-importance. I wonder if you know anyone in your life right now that is hamstrung in their ability to do what God has called them to do because of their own ego, their own sense of self-importance. I wonder if any of us are in that position ourselves. If our ego, our own sense of self-importance, is alienating us from God. The next thing that self-importance does is that it blinds us to our own sin. When you have an overly realized sense of self-importance, it will make you not have insight into your own behavior. In Jeremiah chapter 17, it says this: "The heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it?" The heart is deceitful and it's sick. It leads us astray. Maybe you've heard the advice given before where someone says, "Follow your heart and it will take you in the right place." Well, that's a lie. It's not true. That's terrible advice. If you follow your heart, it's going to deceive you. It's desperately sick. It confuses us. It leads us away from seeing our own sin. I have some examples of this in Rousseau's life. For one, when he's complaining about the difficulties of his life, he says this: "What could your miseries have in common with mine? My situation is unique, unheard of since the beginning of time." Now, this guy sounds like a little bit of a drama queen to me when I read these quotes. He said, "No one has ever had it harder than me." Now, again, I wonder if you've seen this in other people's lives when their self-importance leads them to think that the situations that befall them are so much worse than everyone else. No perspective over the difficulties of life because of their self-importance. One thing that Rousseau would often do is that he would have these relationships with others that would start well because one thing I meant to say this about Rousseau earlier. Whatever it is, Rousseau had it. I don't know if you've ever known someone like this in your life. They just have the it factor. People are drawn to them. They want to listen to them. They want to hear from them. Rousseau was that kind of guy. So he could make friendships quickly, but often they would break, and it was because of his own inability to see his own flaws. I want to read a quote. This one is delightful. He says this: "I love myself too much to hate anybody." What a great line. But it also wasn't true. He continued to say this: "Never have I known the hateful passions. Never did jealousy, wickedness, vengeance enter my heart. Anger occasionally, but I'm never crafty enough to bear a grudge." That's what he says about himself. Paul Johnson, who is an incredible biographer, I'm actually leaning on him for a lot of this material, said this. He said, "In fact, he frequently bore grudges and was crafty in pursuing them." And so what you have in Rousseau was a guy who did not have good relationships with other people. He was filled with envy and malice, but he was so self-deluded that he thought he wasn't envious. He thought he wasn't jealous. He thought he wouldn't pursue his anger, but he did over and over again. Self-importance blinds us to our own sin, which leads to the next point that I want to talk about. Self-importance also crushes our relationships with other people. In the Proverbs, Solomon says this. He says, "An unfriendly person pursues selfish ends, and against all sound judgment starts quarrels." A bad friend is a person who constantly starts quarrels. And one thing that we know for sure from Rousseau's letters is that he quarreled with people all the time. Almost every person that he had a meaningful relationship with, he would have a knockdown, drag out, call the cops kind of quarrel with them. And afterward, every time, he would write a really long letter of remonstrance telling the other person why it was their fault that they had quarreled. Now, that's great marriage advice, by the way. If you're wondering how to be on the right page with your spouse, after you fight, write a note explaining to them clearly why it was their fault. Anyway, this is what Rousseau would do. And I love this quote from Paul Johnson talking about him. He says this: "Rousseau was the first intellectual, among many, by the way, to proclaim himself repeatedly the friend of all mankind." So Rousseau said, we talked about this earlier, he was the wisest man alive, the best friend to all mankind. He loved humankind. But loving as he did humanity in general, he developed a strong propensity for quarreling with human beings in particular. This is a thing that you will actually see repeatedly from people who claim to love humanity. They say that they love people, but they can't get along with any individual person. You know, when you see a person in your life that is constantly quarreling with the people that are around them, that is a symptom of a sick heart underneath the surface. By the way, I'm not just saying that for you to look to other people in that way. If you find yourself constantly quarreling with the people in your life, that shows you that under the surface, under the hood of your life, there's something awry. There's something not going correctly. And that's how Rousseau was. He said he was the friend of all mankind, but he feuded with everyone. Well, we can see with his interactions with people why this might happen. He loved taking presents from other people. So I mentioned before, he had the it factor. People wanted to know him, and so they would give him money. They would want to patron him. They'd want to give him places to stay. And this is the way that he talked about the people who would give him things. He said this: "When I surrender to prolonged entreaties to accept an offer, repeated over and over again, I do so for the sake of peace and quiet rather than my own advantage. So when someone offers me a gift, I take it just so that they leave me alone. However much it may cost the giver, he's actually in my debt, for it costs me more." So what Rousseau would do is if someone would give him a gift, he'd say, "You're welcome." Well, again, great marriage advice. Try that with your spouse and see how it works. He was so deluded from his own self-importance that he had no understanding of how to be thankful or grateful to the people that were around him. And so with these feuds that I mentioned to you before, he'd write these long letters, and they would be very persuasive, they'd be very emotional, but they never matched the facts of what actually happened. So one of Rousseau's biographers said this: "All his accounts of his quarrels may have an irresistible persuasiveness, eloquence, and air of sincerity. Then the facts come as a shock." So he gives this long speech about why this wasn't his fault. Then you find out that everything he said was either a lie or twisted or deluded. One of these fallings out he had with a famous British intellectual named David Hume. And Hume did everything he could to make Rousseau's stay in Britain go well, but they fell out for whatever reason. And afterward, Rousseau wrote this thousands of words letter about what happened. And Hume's biographer, talking about the letter, said this: "The letter was consistent with the complete logical consistency of dementia. It remains one of the most brilliant and fascinating documents ever produced by a disordered mentality." One of the things that I love about that quote, that line saying it was a disordered mentality, it actually shows what happens to us when we have an overly inflated ego. It leads to your view of the world being distorted. It leads to your interactions with how you think you are interacting with other people. It distorts your view of what's going on. Your pride, your arrogance, your self-importance can keep you from having any good relationships in your life. A good relationship, a good marriage, or a good parent to a child, what it should look like is a person wanting to understand the other instead of just wanting to be understood. A person who is obsessed with their own self-importance, all they want is to be understood by the other people, and it distorts their view of the world. And that's what happened to Rousseau. So whatever other good qualities he had, he was kept from seeing things as they truly were. So now I want to look to one more thing about Rousseau's life before we bring it home, talking about ourselves. What was the result of his self-delusion and his pride? I think the most damning piece of evidence from Rousseau's life for the kind of person he was morally, even though he claimed to be the best moral man in the world, was what he did with his children. He had a mistress named Therese, and they had 5 children over the course of time that they were together. Well, with all 5 of these children, Rousseau convinced her to abandon these children to an orphanage. Now, what he said to her was that she needed to do this to save her honor, and that the orphanage could take care of the children. Well, here's a few things we know about orphanages in France at the time that this happened. 2/3 of children that were put in orphanages would die within the first year of their life. 2/3, that's 66%. Only 5% of those children would live to adulthood, and basically all of them would be beggars or vagabonds. Essentially what Rousseau did with these 5 children was that he abandoned them to death. He was completely derelict in his most important responsibility that God ever placed in his life. He abandoned them to death. Now, it's worth noting and looking at his excuses for why he did this. Late in his life, he was in a quarrel with another famous intellectual named Voltaire. Surprise, surprise, he was quarreling with someone who was one of his friends. And Voltaire accused him of being cruel for abandoning his children. And so here's how he responded. He responded a few ways. The first one was this: he blamed his decision on the godless intellectuals that he was friends with for putting the idea of the orphanage into his innocent mind. My friends made me do it. It was their fault. That's excuse number 1. Excuse number 2 is this. He said, I know full well no father is more tender than I would have been. but he didn't want them to be exposed to Teresa's mother. So he said, I would have been the best father in the world, but the mother-in-law would have been that bad to where it's better for them to go to an orphanage. Again, that shows you, twisted, deluded, not seeing clearly mind. The last excuse is probably the closest to what was actually true in his mind. He said this, how could I achieve the tranquility of mind necessary for my work if my garret was filled with domestic cares and the noise of children? He basically was saying, how could I give my gift of brilliance to the world if I had kids running around? And so his response was to essentially sentence his 5 children to death. Now here's all I want to do in talking about Rousseau. It doesn't matter how talented you are. It doesn't matter how great you actually are. If you have an overinflated ego, an overinflated sense of importance, you will be led into delusion. You will be led into sin. You will be led into having broken, horrible relationships. You will be led into falling so far off of God's path from your life that you won't know which way you're turning. Self-delusion, self-importance, it is a deadly delusion every single time. So, if we've talked at the beginning about the fact that all of us struggle with that idea of thinking we're more important than we are, what is the antidote to that? How do we keep from getting so far gone that we're like Rousseau, where we're making horrible moral decisions while thinking that we're not making bad decisions? And I think the answer is pretty simple. It's embedded in the parable itself. The tax collector, who clearly was a flawed man, was beating his chest, saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. What he displayed was a broken, contrite heart over his sin. A broken, realistic, contrite heart over the things that we've done. Taking an honest look at what our heart looks like and expressing that to God. That is the antidote to self-importance. When you look to God's nature in comparison to your own, and you're honest about your faults and your sin, that is where we can start to see who we really are and who God has really made us to be. A broken and contrite heart over our sin. The results are this. When we have a broken heart over sin, one, it gives us a chance to actually be close to God. God humbles the proud. That's one of the things that Scripture is very clear about. Any pride that you have dripping in your heart and in your mind is going to separate you from God. An honest, contrite heart over your sin, that is what can lead you to feel close to God. If you, or maybe you find yourself in a season of life right now where you don't feel close to God, the first recommendation I would give to you is examine yourself, and is there any undealt with, unconfessed sin in your heart? I think that's the first thing that can make you feel not close to God. Closeness to God comes from honesty about what's going on inside our heart and in our mind. The second thing is this. A broken and contrite heart over sin does something incredible for us, and it's that it actually allows us to have insight into why we do the things that we do. I think so many of us find ourselves in spirals of making poor decisions in life, and we don't even know why we're doing the things that we're doing. Well, once we start to confess our sin to the Lord, the thing that you're going to find is that you will start to have insight into why you did the thing that you did and how to not do it the next time. And I don't know how to make this any clearer, because I think this is very important for us to know. Sin itself, if you're living in sin, it never leads to insight in your life. You are not going to make good decisions with your life if you have undealt with sin in your heart. When you bring that sin to the Lord, even if you know that you're broken and you don't have a solution to it right away, you come to him with a contrite heart, he will start to show you what you need to do. He will start to give you insight into why you're doing the things that you're doing. And the last thing is this. When we have a broken and contrite heart over our sin, we start to have the ability to restore our broken relationships. If you want to have good relationships in your life, you need to find yourself being honest about the sin in your life and not having an overinflated ego. Sometimes you will find people with a huge ego, an overinflated sense of self-importance, that are successful in the world. They may accomplish things. You very, very rarely, never, find a person with an overwhelmingly inflated sense of self-importance that has good relationships in their life. Never. It never happens. It's antithetical. If you want to have a good marriage, if you want to have a good relationship with your kids or with your parents or with anybody, you have to be humble. Jesus says, those who humble themselves will eventually be exalted. So where does this leave us? Just a few really simple thoughts. If you are acting like the world revolves around you, you have to change your perspective. If you are prideful, you are going to be humbled. God is calling you to be a person who knows exactly who you are, no more, no less. when you know God and you're looking to him and you're honest about the sin that's in your heart, who knows what God can do with your life going into the future?